All right, you ready to do it?
Ready?
All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Books, Read, Thrive podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Bill O'Hanlon. Bill, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome. So Bill is a dynamic, inspirational, professional speaker and prolific author, about 40 books so far, who's worked to motivate people and organizations to determine what they're meant to be doing and to remove the barriers to succeeding at those goals. He's mostly invested in his career as a songwriter in this season of life, but he feels he still has more to teach on mental health and positive change. He maintains an online presence with offerings on Ericksonian Hypnosis, the solution-oriented approach, becoming a paid public speaker, and how to write and publish books. He's also working on new material on overcoming depression, treating anxiety, phobias, panic, thriving in the wake of trauma, and more. I invited him on specifically to talk about his book, Do One Thing Different, but obviously we'll talk about a lot more things. Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Guy. Nice to meet you. Nice to be on.
Appreciate that. So before we get going, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Well, I grew up around Chicago, suburb of Chicago. My folks were from Nebraska, and my mother actually flew back to Nebraska to be with her mother while she had me. So I was born in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, but I grew up around Chicago 18 years, went off to school in Arizona, college, undergraduate and graduate school, became a therapist there, and was also a singer-songwriter in my younger years. And those two have sort of come together again in my later life.
Awesome. So if we can, I mean, your output and what you do is so friggin' inspiring. I just have to say that there's so much obviously to talk about, but if we can, I'd like to start with a broader picture about how you got into in your interest in therapy, of course, and creativity, and how you channel that, and then we can start dial into the book. So, how did this start for you?
There's a bunch of places one could start, but I grew up in a big Irish Catholic family around Chicago, and my family had this rule: when you turned 18, you either went out to work or you went to school. You went away to school. They really wanted to encourage that independence, and so there was none of this baby boomerang thing here. They, when you left, they broke your plate, sawed off your corner of the table, and someone took your room. So I was the least prepared of those kids because I was the run to the litter, shy one. I was a middle kid, but I was the shy one, my mother's favorite kind of thing, very sensitive, and I was not prepared to go out in the world. And I went out during that turbulent time, the late 60s, early 70s, and I got lost. I went to a massively big university, Arizona State, and there were 500 people in a beginning class, a 101 class, as they call them in the States here. And I just got lost, and I wasn't eating well. I was on a budget. I couldn't afford much, and I would spend most of my budget on books and records because I was into music and reading. And then I would starve for a few days, and friends would sometimes take pity and feed me. But and then I just got disconnected, and I became really very depressed, dangerously depressed. And then I was thinking of taking my life, and a friend talked me out of it. It's a long story. But after I started to come out of that deep depression, I got really interested in psychology. Obviously, it's like, what happened to me? Why did that happen? I didn't know that much about therapy or anything like that. And I got kind of obsessed, again, a big reader, and I read everything I could about psychotherapy, changed my major to psychology, got a psychology undergraduate degree, and then went on to become a therapist in graduate school. And when I was becoming a therapist, I didn't have much money in my undergraduate. I worked at an art gallery at Arizona State for a work study job. And a guy came in who was a famous psychiatrist who I didn't know was a famous psychiatrist. But after he left, I researched him and I became fascinated with his work. His name was Milton Erickson. He was a pioneer in the field of medical hypnosis, and he was a pioneer in the field of brief therapy, very short-term therapy. He had a way of harnessing people's abilities, resources, and strengths rather than focusing on their deficits and what was wrong with them and their pathologies and their diagnoses. And that really appealed to me because when I was depressed, I spent a lot of time focusing on my faults and my
Mm.
deficits. And if somebody had come along and helped me focus on what I did have going for myself, that would have made all the difference for me. So I became fascinated with his work, read everything I could, again, big reader. And I started in graduate school to argue with my professors, shy as I was. I was like, why are you so focused on what's wrong with people? Why can't we also recognize what's right with people? And to tell you the truth, that's what propelled me out at a very early age, once I graduated from graduate school, into speaking. Because again, painfully shy, terrified of speaking in front of people, never spoke up in my undergraduate years in classes. In my graduate school, I started to speak a little more. There's smaller classes, and I was a little more comfortable. But I decided to go out and be a speaker and, tell
Because
people
why?
about this.
Oh, to tell people.
I
Okay.
was so passionate. To tell you the truth, I think there are four energies that tell people what they're supposed to do in life. I've thought about this over the years, either in clients that I've seen in psychotherapy. I think it's true in friends, in my own life. And there are bliss, blessed, pissed, and dissed. And blissed is, what do you love? And at that point, I loved psychotherapy. I read everything I could about it, went to every workshop I could. Blessed, I had a friend who helped me, not kill myself. She blessed me. I had a sister who was like, wow, you're so great. You should be on Oprah. I mean, I was like a young therapist. I didn't know anything. She just thought, she invited me to do a panel once on something on feminism, actually, in the early 70s. And she was like, that was so great. You should be on Oprah. And I'm like, what are you talking about? But she blessed me. She believed in me. And so that's blissed and blessed. But the darker sides, or the more negative sides, are pissed and dissed. And pissed, I was so mad about what's going on in psychotherapy, because if I'd gone to a person who focused on what was wrong with me when I was depressed, I might have done myself in. And so I
Mm.
was passionate about it for a personal reason, but also for professional reasons. I was so impressed with the results that Dr. Erickson was getting with his patients. I don't call them patients, I call them clients, but he was getting results with impossible cases, and sometimes very 1 or 2, 3 sessions. I was like, what? How do you do that? That's not what they're teaching me in
Mm.
graduate school. And so I was pissed that that wasn't being represented, and that people were being made to stay longer in therapy when they may be able to get out a lot quicker. And then dissed, I was sexually molested when I was a kid, and it really messed me up in a certain way. But it also gave me a certain kind of strength, because the person who molested me sort of maneuvered me into that situation by confusing me.
Mhm.
And I developed a compensatory skill, which is, again, back to people have resources. They're not just all messed up. I was certainly messed up by my abuse, but I would also developed a strength because of it. I have this ability to take a lot of complex material and make it really clear and simple, like I just did with the four energies that tell you what you're supposed to do with your life: bliss, blessed, pissed, and dissed. I mean, that's a lot of material for a whole life, but I just put it together in a simple list. I developed that compensatory skill because I hated to be confused. And when something
Mhm.
was confusing, I would spend some time really trying to make it clear. I did that with Milton Erickson's work, the guy who was my mentor. I did that with some other parts of psychotherapy. And I went out and started speaking and explaining this stuff to people. And I had a gift for it, I guess. And I'd had a lot of words stored up all those years. I was shy. And after about 5 or 6 years of speaking all around my region, then I started going national and international. People said, where's your book? I need the book on this stuff. And I'm like, oh, a book? I don't know how to write a book. I'm a little hyper anyway, and I certainly don't know anything about how to write and publish a book. And after about 8 or 9 years, my first book came out, and my second book came out the same year, weirdly. I wrote them a couple of years apart, but just the vagaries of the publishing industry. And I was on a roll. And, my first book took 3 years, and it was blood on the keyboard. And my second book actually came out before the first book, and that took 9 months. I got a little better at it. And a book a year for a bunch of years after that. And then I started writing books in months instead of years, and it became a lot easier. And I just never stopped. And I try and make myself not write books at this point,
Let me hold
because
on
I
a
have
second. Let me just
4 or
say,
5 on my computer that I don't want to write. I'd rather write songs at this moment. But
let
yeah,
me
go
just
ahead.
say, wow. I mean, come on. You are friggin' incredible. Let me ask you this, when you were going through that dark time, did you actually see a therapist?
No, I didn't even have it. I didn't know about therapy. It wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now.
Right.
Back in the Paleolithic ages, I saw the Beatles live. That'll sort of carbon date how old I am. And so I just didn't know anything about therapy, and I didn't have the financial resources. I was a poor student. They didn't have quite the campus mental health stuff that they do now. I
Right.
didn't know about therapy, and I didn't know how to get myself to therapy. And I was in bed 20 hours a day sleeping. Even
Oh
if
my
I
God.
had the idea, I don't know if I could have mobilized myself to get there. So no, I never went to therapy, but I became interested in, like, how would somebody have helped me when I was in that place, because I didn't get any help. And
Right.
that's what sort of initially mobilized me to become a therapist. I wanted to understand myself and help other people. I was a hippie in those days. If you're watching this on video, I don't know if this is audio or video, but if you're watching this on video, I've gone back to my hippie style. I have long hair again, after many years of not having long hair. But I was a hippie, and so I had that let's change the world in a positive way kind of philosophy, peace, love, and trying to change the world in a good way. So I channeled that into becoming a therapist.
I think it's so interesting. When I picked up this book, Do One Thing Different, I was uh, really excited and really inspired, and it felt fresh. It's kind of crazy that it did feel fresh to me. And I think it does so because we're in this context, this mental health culture where, just as you're saying, how do we, what's wrong? There's so much emphasis placed on pathology and what's wrong. When you started speaking, obviously you're passionate about it now. What did you want to communicate about what Erickson was saying? What did you want to say to people?
That people could change, that people could change relatively quickly, sometimes, not all the time, that it didn't need to take, the Woody Allen 20 years of psychoanalysis kind of thing. And that people had resources, abilities, strengths, and solutions. And then maybe one last thing, and that is, I didn't like the normative model, the one that said, here's what real mental health is, and here's what pathology or mental illness is. Partly because when I started as a therapist, homosexuality was still a disease in what they
Mm,
call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It was voted on when I became a therapist by the Psychiatric Association to not make it be a disease. So I knew that diagnoses were infused with morals, moral judgments, and cultural blind spots. That is, you know, there was, in the most absurd example I could ever find when I was teaching about this through the years, there was a psychiatrist early on and they were called alienists in those days, back in the old days, who tried to create a diagnosis for slaves that ran away from their slave owners being a pathology. And it's like, come on, you know? And then Freud and, his followers saying that women had to have, um, you know, penis-based orgasms or it was a pathology. If they had clitoral-based orgasms, that was, it's like those kind of crazy, biased things that people don't even see their biases. They have these blinders on. They were male biases, white, privilege biases. They were class biases, they were gender biases, they were sexual preference biases. So I knew that stuff infused diagnoses, and I wanted us to recognize, be careful of imposing by accident or because you think you're so certain of what's true and what's right, those diagnostic categories and pathologizing categories, what's wrong with people, because they may be infused with your moral judgments and blind spots because of your, your cultural and gender and personal biases.
So, do you think all this emphasis on pathologizing was just driven by the culture of psychotherapy, the onset of psychotherapy, and
Well, it's also driven by the culture of money. It's finances. You can't get, like if I had my druthers as a therapist, I wouldn't really give people labels generally, but you can't get reimbursed by insurance if you don't give somebody a label.
Right.
And so I think that it's economic as well as driven by theory, and the theory that we got trickle down Freudian theory, which is pretty outdated. The research indicates generally it doesn't work very well or any better than any other therapy. But that's what came to dominate the initial diagnostic categories that came into psychotherapy, because Freud and his followers were the most influential by the time the first manual was made with all these diagnoses. So I think that's part of the issue. And it became entwined with money and moneyed interests. And so managed care came in the middle of my career and it said, okay, now the financial people, insurance people are going to tell you how to do treatment and how long to do treatment, which is, in a weird way, it helped my career, because people who were really long-term therapists were like, how do I ethically provide services to people in 1, 2, or 3 sessions? And I was like, I've got a model. I'll tell you how I can do it. And I don't think it's a Band-Aid on a gaping wound or limiting people's access to mental health services. So I became passionate about spreading that word, and it happened that the insurance companies were my allies for a brief moment.
So you have a lot of examples in the book. Do one thing different. Can we get specific here? What does it look like? How does this work?
Well, I think, again, when people come in and they say, like, if I were the client, I'm depressed, I can barely get out of bed, I can't function very well, I don't think I have much of a future, I have no energy. And the first question I would have is, I do a little empathy, like, wow, it sounds really tough and really hard. So you don't just gloss over their problems and, hear about them, things like that. And then the next question I have is, given all that, I'm really curious, how did you get yourself out of bed this morning to get to my office? Because it sounds like basically you had to crawl out of bed and you had to make yourself get dressed. And how did that happen in the face of all that? It's like somebody else could just get out of bed, get dressed, and go out to wherever they're going. You seem to have to slug through mud up to your thighs. And what do you think it is about you that you could do that? What does that say about you? And also, how did you get that to happen? And that's the first question I'd have. And then we explore that for a little while. The second question,
if I may, so that question is to what? You're asking that
strengths and abilities, instead of focusing them on what's wrong with them, which they're already pretty focused on.
Right.
So I'm trying to balance it a little and saying, yep, things are pretty bad. And you also have some resources and strengths here. And when you have that conversation, you can, not always, but often you'll see that person shift. They'll be like, wow, maybe I'm not so crazy or bad or helpless or hopeless. And just asking a question. I used to think questions were for information, and they are, but questions also communicate something. And I want to communicate possibilities, hope, strengths, and solutions, and evoke those from inside. And so that's my first question. The second question is, have you ever faced anything really like this before? It's super difficult, almost putting you down, for the count, and come back from it. And if so, how did you do that? So I'm trying to balance all that. I'm hopeless, I'm helpless, I'm sick, I'm crazy, I'll never get out of this, with you've been through this before, you have resources. Let's see if we can marshal some of those resources and see if we can move you through this a little more quickly than you might have moved through it on your own.
Now, let's contrast this with a quote unquote conventional therapist or conventional perspective on how depression is treated.
Tell me more about your depression. What's it like?
Right.
What are the thoughts that go through your mind? And tell me, is there a family history of depression? And all of a sudden now we're focused on depression, 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 depression.
Right. Right.
And, nothing wrong with asking those questions, find out information. But if you don't infuse it with a little hope and possibility, that person starts to get more and more helpless feeling. It evokes those feelings of depression more in the conversation. So I try to marble in, asking about the experience of depression, not so much the history. I'm not so interested in that. I'm
Mhm.
interested in the history of how they, came out of depression or persisted in the face of depression. Those are really curious questions for me, but also infusing some hope and possibility questions with the informational history taking, diagnostic questions that one has to do to get paid in therapy land.
It's so interesting because, as I said, when I was reading this, I found myself excited and inspired and thinking, wow, maybe there are ways I can move through what I'm personally going through. Maybe it was oddly, like I said, kind of fresh, like a new perspective.
Mhm.
And as you're saying, that's totally the way generally I think therapy treats depression. Okay, is there a history, right? So that, and if there is, that's already giving someone a reason. Well, of course I'm depressed. My parents were depressed. Of course I'm going to follow in their footsteps.
Yeah, I
And
have
it's
bad genes. I have a
right.
broken biological neurological system, and all that may be true. I don't know. I'm neutral on causes. I'm much more interested in what'll help people change.
Yeah. What you said, when you were going through your own dark time, you wish there was someone there who could have done it. What do you wish someone would have asked you?
You know, what the thing that actually got me, which my friend basically did. So I'll tell you a little of the story because this is a question that also we use in this solution-based approach, the solution-focused approach, solution-oriented approach that I write about and do one thing different. And that is my friend. I went to tell my friend, I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't think I can make it. I'm too depressed. I don't see any future. I can barely function. All I want to do is not be around people because it hurts too much to be around, out in the world.
Mhm.
And, I'm too shy and I can't do anything. I don't say anything I want to say. All I want to do is like write songs, write poetry, read and sleep. I mean, and I, and now I'm in this protected environment of a university, but in a couple of years, I'm going to have to go out and work. And I don't think I can do it. And she said, look, all right, please don't do this. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I think I have to. And she said, your parents came from Nebraska, right? And I go, yeah. She said, well, I have 3 aunts that live in Omaha. They've never married. I'm their favorite niece. They've saved their money and invested in farmland. And they, because the farmers were all moving out, it was a bad time in farming, and they were investing in that. And they just ran out the farm to the next door neighbor farmer, and they would get some income from it. She said, they have told me when they die, I'm going to inherit everything they have. They have some savings, but also they have this land. And there's always an abandoned farmhouse on one of these farms because nobody's living there anymore. So if you promise me you won't kill yourself, I'll promise you once one of my aunts dies, you can go live in one of those farmhouses rent free. You won't have to earn money. You don't have to go out and work. You can write your poetry. You can write your songs. You can be by yourself. You can grow your own food, which in my delusional state as a hippie back in the 70s, reading Mother Earth News, I actually thought I could do. I tried it years later. It's really hard to grow your own food. Hard to grow pizza, I've discovered too. It takes many years to get one pizza together. But and that's my little joke about it. But I was like, that's a possibility. And for the first moment, I wasn't so focused on the past, the painful past, or the unchangeable present.
Mm.
The future had sort of disappeared from me. I thought it's going to be about the same or worse. And all of a sudden, a new future opened up where I wouldn't be in such pain.
Mhm.
And I thought, that's appealing. And then I said to her, before I agreed, how old are your aunts? She said, well, they're in their 60s. And I thought, well, in my mind at 19, I was like, well, they're almost dead, now as I'm near that age, I'm like, it's pretty young, really. And there's something in the water in Nebraska. Those ants ultimately lived till 90s, into their 90s. So I would have had to wait a lot of years. But I was like, okay, there are three of them. The odds are one of them is going to die. I can hold on by my fingernails until one of them dies, and then maybe I'll be out of such pain. And so one question I wish someone would ask me is, what are your hopes for your future? When you come through this depression, which would have been a good question, because I never thought I'd get through it. If they asked the question, presuming I would get through it someday, which I did, of course, when you get through this depression, what kind of life do you want? What do you want to do with your life? And I'd be like, well, I'd like to be a songwriter. I'd like to change the world in a positive way. I'd like to work in ecology. I had all sorts of things I thought I might be able to do if I could function. Nobody asked me that question. And, again, I didn't go to therapy, but nobody would have if I'd gone to therapy. They would have said, tell me about your feelings. Tell me about your thoughts. Tell me about your history. Tell me how long this has been going on. Tell me what you're doing each day. It's like, okay, I can tell you all that, but that's not going to move me out of it. And so, I think that I look for resources, solutions, strengths, and abilities in the past. How did you make it through something like this before? In the present, how did you get yourself out of bed to my office? And what will life be like when you're no longer depressed? And you can use this with anxiety. You can use it with people that are cutting themselves. You can use it with people, any kind of issue. It doesn't depend on the diagnosis. It depends on the questioning, interaction, connection process of connecting people with their resources, strengths, and abilities, and with the future with possibilities, and reaching back into the past for solutions, resources, and strengths.
I appreciate you sharing that. So as we kind of wind down here, who is this book for? Who would you say it's for?
Well, I wrote a bunch of books for therapists. That was my first number of books. And then I started writing books for the general public because I thought, I'm speaking to therapists, which is great. I'm getting to people who are seeing people, and that has a ripple effect. But then I thought, but people still have this idea that therapy is about going and getting a diagnosis, spilling the beans, and talking about your childhood and how the traumas that you had and your parents and your family history. They're not knowing that there's an alternative to this. So it's for anyone who's struggling with an issue that they feel stuck with and they haven't found a solution. There may be the roadmap to a solution in there. There may be an actual method to solve your own problem with this book. That's what it's for anybody who's suffering and would like to make a change.
So pretty much everybody.
Yeah, pretty much everybody.
Pretty much everybody.
That was my goal, is to people who would seek therapy or who wouldn't seek therapy because they thought it was not the right thing for them.
Right,
because they didn't want to go into their childhood. They didn't want to focus on what was wrong with them, and they didn't want to pay the money, and they, whatever, all the reasons that they were embarrassed. They didn't want to be vulnerable. They, all that stuff. Yeah. Somebody like that.
All right. So one more final question. Look, I've got to ask you, how have you managed this creative torrent, this torrential outpouring? How have you identified yourself to be able to do, be a therapist, write these books, become a musician?
Early on as a therapist, I saw people come in, and some people worked hanging out by the fingernails so they could get off work in the evenings and on the weekends. And other people came in and, not like they didn't have problems, but they loved their work and they were passionate about their work. So they didn't have to postpone living until they got off work. And I thought, I want door number 2. I want that one where I love what I do. And I've been able to follow that energy, those 4 energies I've talked about, which have informed me. When do I have a lot of energy? I always go for the energy meters. Like, when I first became a therapist, I couldn't get enough of that. I read everything about psychotherapy. I love being a psychotherapist. And then after a while, I started speaking. And at first, I was totally nervous and hated getting up there. It was stage fright and terribleness. And then I came to love it. And then I did it, and I sort of overdid it. I traveled around 3 times a month all over the world. And, it was great, but I was exhausted. And I was working too much and neglecting my family and friends. And then I started shifting more into the book writing, and then I put stuff online, and I did a bunch of online courses. And then that sort of all started to fade for me. When the energy fades, I find the next thing that energizes me, and it keeps me alive. And I got to the point where I didn't need to make any more money, and I was retiring. I let go of my clinical practice, and I was not traveling around anymore. I put all my stuff online, and I was like, what do I do now? And I remembered an earlier dream of being a songwriter and poet. And I went back to that, and I've been doing that for the last 6 years. And I've written close to 1,500 songs, and I've gotten 80 of them recorded, 81 if we wait till the 7th of July. That'll be coming out by other people, my songs. And I go to Nashville once a month and write a bunch of songs. And I write more than a song a day, and I'm loving it, and I'm still alive. So it's good.
That is so inspiring. So you follow your heart, you follow your energy.
Yeah,
it sounds like you trust your
Blissed and Dissed, all through that. Yeah.
Has that always been there, that trusting of your?
Pretty early on. No, not always. I didn't always follow it. I did things out of duty, and no, I should do this and I should do this. But again, being a therapist, you see people are so unhappy when they did what they thought they should do instead of what they know in their heart that is there for them to do and has meaning and purpose. And so for me, it's always what has energy, meaning, and purpose, and what contributes to the world. Obviously, that's back to my old hippie values. But yeah, I've been able to follow that energy, and it's kept me alive. And I was just in Nashville writing, and someone asked me, it came up in conversation how old I was, and he said, "No way," and he guessed I was about 20 years younger than I am. And I was like, well, that's nice. I mean, I feel my age, and I certainly am fine being my age, but I do feel this energy that's not that common to people in my vintage. So.
Wow. All right, Bill, what's the best way for people to contact you, get in touch with you?
Well, I knew you were going to ask this question, and I'm going to have a weird answer. I do not want people to get in touch with me. I have no interest in people getting in touch with me. They can find my books on Amazon, Bill O'Hanlon, and there's a bunch of them on there. Some are out of print by now. I do not want people to contact me or even see my work. I mean,
well, I meant learn about you. I guess I should rephrase
learn
it.
About you. Right.
Okay.
I know what you mean. So I have a website, billohanlon.com or billohanlon.org, and you can go on and see that. But and I have some songs that are out. I have a Spotify playlist, songs of Bill O'Hanlon have been recorded by other people. And other than that, I just want to do my work. And I was in the public eye for a long time, and I do not want to be in the public eye that much anymore. Happy to be on here with you and get to know you and share this stuff with people. But the world was too much with me for about 30 years, and I've sort of pulled back into my old introverted self, and I'm quite enjoying it.
Well, I appreciate it. And I doubly appreciate you coming on this podcast. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. We have a mutual friend that recommended you highly and spoke highly of you. So.
I appreciate that. All right. Take care.